Hey guys, it's Josh, and in this video I'll be going over all the political parties in the APUSH curriculum. Before I start, just keep in mind, like with these political parties and systems, the parties, they change their platforms a lot based on obviously the political situation and different crises going on. So we begin with the first party system, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton. They favor a strong national government, the Bank of the United States, closer ties with Britain, and this is really manifested in the Constitution, saying that like the federal government need to be powered. They didn't like the Articles of Confederation. Um, we have the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. They preferred states' rights and an agricultural economy. They don't like the bank, and they sided with France as opposed to Great Britain. We see that in the French Revolution. The Federalists are hesitant to support what the French are doing. The Democratic Republicans say yes, and they're kind of okay with the Reign of Terror. Um, the Democratic Republicans, they're more concerned about protecting individual liberty from government overreach. They're the big proponents of the Bill of Rights. One important example of when these two ideologies come to conflict was the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. Um, the Federalists, it limited free speech. You couldn't criticize the government, harsher deportation laws. That ultimately led to backlash in the states with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which said that states could nullify federal laws. This starts turning around in the election of 1800, also known as the Revolution of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson gets elected, um, beating John Adams. This is a peaceful transfer of power, proving that the political system is working without any violence. And then the Federalists, they start collapsing after the War of 1812. And the Hartford Convention, just know that the Hartford Convention was like the Federalists' last try to condemn whatever the Democratic Republicans were doing. Yeah. After the War of 1812, we get the Era of Good Feelings. Um, this is basically like a surge of nationalism from the War of 1812, and also like this belief that like we only had one political party, there was not going to be any more division. Obviously not true. There's still divisions with sectionalism over things like slavery, tariffs, regional economic differences, stuff like that. This becomes very clear in the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote but loses the presidency after John Quincy Adams gets voted by the House of Representatives. Jackson and his supporters say this was a corrupt bargain. They say that Henry Clay and Adams, uh, they like made a deal. Jackson gets really popular. Remember, he was like a big war hero. So we get this idea of Jacksonian democracy. Jackson like embodies the common man. He expands voting rights to most white males. Um, but he also expands federal power pretty significantly. He uses the spoils system to reward political supporters with government jobs. He vetoes the return of the National Bank, which is really bad because then he establishes pet banks and that leads to the Panic of 1837. He's also responsible for expanding federal power or the executive branch over the judicial branch after, in Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court said you can't remove the Indians or Native Americans in Jackson anyways. Um, in response to Jackson, we get three parties. I don't know why this slide doesn't have it, but the Whigs are one of them. The Whigs are basically championed by Henry Clay. Um, and Henry Clay, under his American system, was all about like the bank, tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. We also have the Anti-Masonic Party, which is basically like we hate Jackson, and then the Know Nothing Party was the first nativist party that we get. Uh, the Whig Party ultimately collapses under sectional pressure and slavery because the Whig Party wasn't diverse enough. It didn't uh, foster much unity because it was just based on like northwestern economic kind of stuff. Um, and as slavery becomes a big issue, we see a couple of new parties form, the Liberty Party and the Free Soil parties, both of which oppose expanding slavery into Western territories. The Free Soil Party mainly did it for economic reasons. And then we have the Kansas-Nebraska Acts, just remember like the compromises on slavery and stuff. And so we get the Republican Party. They're opposed to the idea of popular sovereignty, um, stuff like that. And this ultimately builds up to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. Um, who is like probably the number one Republican of all time. Um, and the southern states they didn't cast a single vote for him in the electoral college. So of course we get the Southern secession leads to the Confederacy. Um, and yeah, after the Civil War we get the Dixiecrats and Democrats. We have the Southern Democrats are mainly the ones like in power in the South, and you can kind of think of them as Dixiecrats because they were very segregationist. They didn't want whatever the Republicans were doing to try and like fix segregation and stuff like that in the South after, yeah, during Reconstruction, which ultimately ends in the Compromise of 1877. I won't go too much in depth, but just know this like took out the Republicans' efforts to help with Reconstruction. Uh, After this, we go into the Gilded Age. We have the two main parties, Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, sorry, are in the North. They're about high tariffs and pro-business by having government hands-off approach with laissez-faire economics. Democrats are in the South, segregationists. They want lower tariffs. But also remember, like at this time period, the Gilded Age, there's a lot of corruption going on because as, of course, monopolies and businesses grow, it's easier for political lobbying to happen, bribes, etc. Um, and so because of this, it was very hard for any legislation to be passed through. This was like one of the most stagnant periods in all of U.S. government history. Uh, Corruption we see manifested in political machines, like Tammany Hall, where like political machines would pay people to vote for them by giving them like jobs, food, etc. We have the credit mobilier scandal, where railroad companies bribed members of Congress. And in response to this, we get the Pendleton Act, which forced civil service exams, which reduced patronage, which is similar to the spoils system. And we get the Populist Party. They're really embodied in the Omaha platform, which called for direct election of senators, government regulation of railroads, a graduated income tax, free silver, and it's not mentioned here, but also the referendum. The populists get defeated in every election they try for, but their ideas still spill over into the progressive era, which is what we're talking about now. The progressives, I guess the big one you can think of is Theodore Roosevelt. He's the trust buster. He focused on regulating large corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving natural resources. He was a big conservationalist. He passed the Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, among others. Um, yeah, there's also William Taft who has dollar diplomacy. Instead of like giving arms to countries and colonies, we give money. Um, that's just a small thing, I guess. Woodrow Wilson continues the reforms of Theodore Roosevelt. He attacked tariffs, banking, and trust with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is like the only successful antitrust act. He creates the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to regulate interstate commerce and business practices. And then, like as a spillover of populists, we get some progressive constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment, which instituted the income tax, 17th for election of senators, 18th for prohibition as a result of the temperance movement, and the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women's suffrage. Um, then we get into the Great Depression and New Deal. Really quickly, like before the Great Depression, we have Herbert Hoover, or I guess during the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who was like past presidents, laissez-faire economics, hands-off approach, from before like progressivism. And so when the Great Depression hits, he's all about like letting companies sort this out, volunteerism, which doesn't work, obviously. And then we get FDR, who's very interventionalist. He obviously the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. He expands federal power and strengthens labor unions, labor rights, etc., etc. Um, yeah, basically, like the big thing with FDR is the social welfare state, saying like the government has a responsibility to ensure the economic and social safety of Americans. Um, like it's debated whether FDR's New Deal actually saved the U.S. economy or not. I don't think that's very relevant though. Um, we get the Democrats starting to split apart because we have a bunch of differences, kind of sectionalist, if you will. Dixiecrats in the South, they're still very segregationist, and the progressive in the North wanted social reforms. Um, Coming to the Cold War, we have Eisenhower, who champions dynamic conservatism. He was all about like still having social programs like education, the highway, etc., while like having more laissez-faire economics, capitalism stuff. Obviously, Cold War communism versus capitalism approaches. We get the 1960s, major civil rights movement and social unrest. This is where we start like going back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. This is like the true Democrat-Republican parties that we think of today. Democrats more like liberal, Republicans conservative. Um, I guess I won't go into too much like biography of these presidencies, but JFK and LBJ were all about civil rights, voting rights. LBJ specifically the Great Society. He launched the war on poverty, expanded Medicare and Medicaid. And because of this, actually a lot of Southern whites started to go to towards the Republicans because obviously the Southern whites didn't like all this stuff. So yeah. Um, yeah, this is kind of where you could pinpoint sort of a political party shift. I would say like the ideas of how much involved the government should be is going to stay constant. Like the Democrats are all about being hands-on and Republicans are about hands-off, but the reasons become different. Like the Democrats are about social reform and Republicans are more about like economic safety and stuff. So then we get Richard Nixon, about Vietnamization, where we leave the Vietnam War, which actually like he reversed after we invaded Laos and Cambodia. But anyways, um, at the same time, he appeals to the silent majority, focusing on law and order and gradually reducing U.S. involvement, but still saying like, oh, people still support the war and stuff. Um, he does de-escalate a lot of tensions with détente, where he meets with China and stuff like that, and then we get the Watergate scandal, so still political corruption is going on. Then we get Gerald Ford and the Carter years. Just know, like during the Cold War, presidencies go between like being interventionist versus like, or sorry, being militaristic versus like diplomatic. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Back here, so Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, this is all the imperial era. We're intervening in other countries, and then World War II, after World War II, or after World War One, before World War II, we're isolationist. Just know that. Then we get to the Reagan Revolution, the New Right. This is where we see conservatism becoming much more radical. Reagan, he cut taxes for the rich with his Reaganomics ideas, supply side economics, trickle down economics, whatever you will, saying that tax cuts for the wealthy would create jobs. It's debated whether or not this worked. It probably did create more jobs, but the wealth gap definitely increased and national debt tripled because he was militaristic, military spending went up. We also get the birth of the religious rights. That's kind of a response to the last period. We got objections to conformity, civil rights movement, and the young generation revolting. The religious right is more about the moral majority, emphasizing conservative Christianity with a pro-life, pro-family, pro-morals, and pro-American agenda. However, Reagan is still a little bit like, I guess, different because we have the first conservative, or first female justice of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. You don't need to know too much about like what I have on the right here. Just know Reagan like bumped up military spending, ultimately led to the end of the Cold War. And then basically like through the contemporary age, just know like political debates get a lot more heated, a lot more controversies going on. We have Bill Clinton who was impeached for an affair and then he lied about it. We get the 2008 election where it was Bush versus Gore, and that was highly contested because it all came down to Florida and the Supreme Court made the decision. We get 9/11, which launches our war on terror, which is bad because like it gets us entangled in foreign affairs, but also the government expands surveillance in this time period. Oh, I guess you could think of it like this. Starting with Nixon and onwards, we become more skeptical of if the government is being truthful or not. Because if you remember, like the government was kind of stuff about the Vietnam War. We get the Patriot Act where the government can like surveil us more. Tea Party movement emerging opposition to government spending. Then we get the Obama and Trump eras. This should be like pretty familiar for you because we're living through it. Obama's pretty radical with the Affordable Care Act and repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell stuff, which was like LGBTQ rights from Ford or something like that. Don't really care. Trump appealed to common Americans with his presidency, revitalizing the MAGA movement. He attempts to undo the Affordable Care Act, impose travel bans, cut taxes, and was impeached twice for abuse of power and incitement of insurrection. It doesn't matter if these things were true or not, it still happened. Polarization still went up. Like, obviously, we know political debates are getting much more heated. That's kind of the common theme across politics. So, the general thing is, like, politics have been changing, parties have been changing. I think I did a fine job of, an okay job of defining what the different stances were. Really quickly, Federalists and Democrat Republicans at the start. Federalists pro big government, anti-federalist, or Democrat Republicans are against that. Then we get Jacksonian Democrats wanting the common man by undoing stuff like the bank. And then we get into the Civil War. Republicans in the North are against slavery. Democrats are pro-slavery. And then during the Reconstruction era, after that, we get into the Gilded Age, political corruption with Tammany Hall and urban political machines. And then we get into World War One, where we have imperialism and Democrats in power, busting up trusts and wanting economic regulation because in the Gilded Age it was laissez-faire, hands-off. And then after World War One, we become isolationist. World War Two, um, we have the Great Depression, FDR, social welfare system. After World War Two, we get the Cold War, interchanging between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are more so about, I guess you could say, government spending, I guess, more militaristic. Um, it's not till the civil rights, really, that we get the clear idea of Democrats are liberal and Republicans are conservative. Government controversy goes up, and then we get to our current age. Political debates are up, polarization is up, ideas of government surveillance are up, etc., etc. I hope that's enough.